try a new experiment today. Try to talk about something a little more substantive than I usually talk about. I'm 73 years old now. I'm retired, but I spent most of my adult life teaching at Duke University in the economics department. Many years ago, I ran across an article in Discover magazine, if I recall, by Marvin Minsky, who was the head of the artificial intelligence department at MIT at that time. Very smart guy. The title of the article really intrigued me. The title was Communicating with an Alien Intelligence. It may be easier than you think. Well, I was hooked. So I read that article, and I'll talk to you a bit about it because I thought it was really very fascinating. So he begins by saying that his story is based on two principles, which he's not going to prove, but he's going to try to justify by examples. The two principles he calls the sparsity principle and the economics principle. Let me talk about the economics principle first. Minsky argues that any alien intelligence, wherever they are in the universe, will likely find that the problems they have to solve tax their mental resources to the limit. So therefore, they will have an incentive to want to economize on the use of their scarce mental resources. Now let me digress here, because as a struggling assistant professor under the publisher parish mandates of the time, I too felt that my scarce mental resources were taxed to the limit. So this idea really resonated with me. The second principle, Minsky calls the sparseness principle. The sparseness has to do with an idea that while there may be many ways to skin the cat, one of those ways will invariably be very much better than any of the others. And he goes on to give a number of examples, most of which, of course, I can't remember, but I do remember one. He talked about, of course, a lot of his stuff comes from the general area of computer science, and he said, suppose you have a list of 10,000 words that you want to sort alphabetically. Now, there are many algorithms to do that. One, I recall, is called bubble sort. Now, I won't talk about what bubble sort involves. It's not really important to the story, but he said, suppose you take a given machine, like an IBM 360, whatever, with a given architecture, and you code each of these algorithms, and you time precisely the time it takes to sort this same list of 10,000 words alphabetically. What you will find, he argues, and he's got a little picture in the book with a graph with a horizontal axis, time to sort, and then he plots for the different algorithms a dot on this axis representing the time that particular algorithm sorted. And if you look at the graph, you see there's a whole cluster of points fairly far out the axis. And then there's one that's very much closer than any of the rest. It's separated by a good distance, very much closer to the origin, which means it took very much less time to sort. And he said that he argued this was generally the case, that and in fact that this one way of skinning the cat was usually so much better than the rest that it was worth taking the time to find that, even though it might not be the first way of doing it that occurred to you. And I'm going to pause now and get some gas and resume my story after that. Well, let me resume my story. As I say, I was very intrigued by this Minsky article. So he goes on to say, whether you take the sparseness principle and the economics principle and you combine them, and the idea is that any intelligent life that wants to economize on its use of its scarce mental resources would have an incentive to find this way of skinning the cat that is so much better than all the others. And that being the case, intelligent life, wherever you find it, would tend to identify the same ways of solving the same class of problems. And then he talks about language is just an outgrowth of our desire to communicate with one another as we're trying to solve problems. And if we're coming up with similar solutions, the structure of the language that facilitates that is going to be similar still. Well, whether you buy all that or not, I thought it was fascinating. And I tended to think it made a lot of sense. Everybody can make their own mind up about that. But anyway, about the same time I had another experience. I had always had problems reading and retaining what I read. And a program that was traveling the country, many representatives I suspect, called Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics. And they would come to a place like Duke and they would hold a series of classes in the night. I think classes maybe lasted a couple hours, and I think there were probably 3 or 4 weeks, one night a week that you went to these. And the idea was to improve your reading speed and comprehension. And as one of the ways of economizing on my scarce mental resources, I thought this would be a good thing. And so I went the first night, and it was a very interesting program. The woman who was teaching it was very good. She did this little exercise where she had a print of a painting we would all know. I don't remember which painting it was. And then she had a big sheet of cardboard that was many times larger than the print of the painting. And in this slit, and in this piece of cardboard, there was cut a small slit. And she would move this slit around on the painting so that anybody in the class could see was whatever part of the painting was visible through this little slit. And she would, you could say, would you move it a little up and to the left? And she would do it. So she did this as long as anybody in the class was willing to engage in the exercise. And then, of course, the game was that as soon as you recognized what the painting was, you were supposed to stick up your hand and say, well, nobody could figure out what the painting was. And then when we all gave up, she, of course, took the cardboard down, and we all knew what the painting was. It was obvious. But the point was that if you're only seeing a small part of the picture at any one time, it's very difficult to grasp the whole scene. And she, of course, made this point rather dramatically. So anyway, the class was very entertaining. The point of that was that you're supposed to look at the whole page at one time, not just a single word. You're supposed to see whole phrases, paragraphs even. And that even though you're not focusing on individual words, you'll get the words and you'll get the meaning. So anyway, after the class was over, I stayed and I talked to her, and I said, I wanted to tell her about my problem and see what she thought my prospects were. So I said to her, I can spend 30 minutes reading one page. And seems like my mind always wanders. Anyway, I get to the end of the page, I've got no idea what I read. And I go back and read it again, and it's the same story. It's just pathetic. And she said to me, I'll never forget, she said, well, you're boring yourself to death. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, your brain wants to receive information at a certain pace, and you're just not giving it the information it wants at the rate it wants to receive it. And since your brain is bored and finds what you're doing tedious, it finds other ways of amusing itself. And that's why your mind is always wandering off to other things and you can't focus. And I said, so what's the solution? I said. She said, read faster. And I kind of laughed and I said, well, exactly how do I do that? She said, just force yourself to read a lot faster. Don't worry about whether you're getting it or not. Just read 10 times faster than you are now. Just force yourself to go through the pages at that kind of clip. And you know what? I went home and did it, and I was just absolutely amazed. My comprehension, I could do it. I could read much faster. My comprehension was infinitely better since I was dividing by 0 from the prior case than it was before. And I can't really remember much of the rest of the class sessions. They were all useful in sort of improving the technique. But that first session, especially the 10 minutes or so I talked to her after class, absolutely changed my life. And I began then on a process. Well, it sort of occurred to me that this was an amazingly useful thing. Not just to me, but I thought it would be to anybody. And I thought, of all the years I'd spent in classes of various sorts, grade school, junior high, high school, college, grad school, nobody had ever talked about anything like that. And moreover, the more I thought about it, nobody had ever really addressed the general question of how I could better economize on the use of my scarce mental resources. And I thought, my God, is that an amazing thing? So, well, anyway, I decided, since I was supposedly in the business of education, that I was going to focus a lot of my scarce mental resources on thinking about what the tricks were and how I could make better use of my resources and how I could actually make these things a habit. There's an old quote by Aristotle that I like very much, but I won't get entirely right, that says, essentially, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an art, but a habit. So I knew that the key thing here was to form good habits. And so I started accumulating a list, and most of the students that had me over the years at Duke would get the current state of my list in the first class session. And my list always started with, it has to be fun. When you're working on solving some problem, trying to get from what you know to what you wish you knew, that process has to be fun. You can't be flogging yourself and talking to yourself about what an idiot you are and not be able to figure this out. You can't be doing any of that stuff. You have to figure out how to make it fun. And if what you're doing now is not making it fun, then you need to quit. Go take a walk. Take a break. Do something else. And when you come back, focus on it has to be fun. Your brain just will not allow you to sustain an effort that's required to solve any hard problem if it's not enjoying the process. So that's the first of my list of items. The second thing on my list, I always called use the force. And this idea begins with the observation that intellectual activity is really challenging in many ways, but the way I'm particularly concerned with right now is that you can't really get a good handle on what you're actually doing when you're using your head. Now, by contrast, if you want to, I took golf lessons with my son one time, and I remember it was kind of amazing because the guy had this high-speed video camera, and he would take pictures of you swinging the club, and then he would go in and in a split screen he would show you your swing on the left and Tiger Woods' swing on the right, this kind of thing. Well, the differences were very apparent. But even without the Tiger Woods shot, you know, you could actually see what you were actually doing, and it usually bore no relationship whatever to what I thought I was doing. Tennis is the same way. A good tennis coach can look at what you're doing and instantly tell you, you know, you're not turning your hips, or your wrist is not in the right position, you know, whatever it is, they can see. So you can get all this, plus even more immediate, you get this immediate feedback. If you hit the tennis ball and it goes over the fence, you know you didn't do something right. And it's so immediate that you can think about what the heck it was you actually were doing at that moment. Same with golf. What is the analog for mental activity? I don't think there's a natural one, but there is a Zen-like device called metacognition. And the general idea, and you probably laugh when you hear this, is that when you're working on something, you devote about 10% of your processing power to thinking about, or being aware of, I should say, what the other 90% is doing. How do I feel right now? Am I having fun? Am I stressed? What's the general status of what's going on? Now, that idea, the Zen part of the idea, is that you don't have to worry about what to do about it. If you're aware of the actual state and you can observe the results that you're getting, you will over time make adjustments. You'll tend to remember the state you were in when things were going really well, and you'll remember the state that you were in when they weren't. And you will just gradually, inevitably drift toward the better states. Metacognition. Use the force. A second component of that, well, a third item on my list, was that involved the subconscious. And I had had so many times in my life the experience that I would have been working on something I couldn't figure out all day long. And I'd finally, in disgust, grab my keys and go out to the car to drive home. And I'd be stopped at a light, not thinking about anything, and all of a sudden the solution would just come to me. Or I would be working on something for days, and I would wake up in the morning just when I'm in that kind of twilight zone where I'm about half awake, and the solution would just come to me. Well, anytime I talked about that in class, you could just see from the faces in the room that many people had that experience. And of course, the idea of using your subconscious is to know that that's the case and to take advantage of it. And the formula I recommended was that if you're working on something, don't flog yourself. Just say to yourself, what it is you'd really like to be able to figure out, in a kind of a non-pressured way. Gee, I wish I knew the answer to this thing. And if you just remind yourself periodically of what it is that you really want to know or figure out, and you relax about it, you're really putting your subconscious in a position to really churn out the solution. And the more I did that in my life, the more I became persuaded that that I could just count on that. I could just count on it. And the more I felt I could count on it, the more I could just relax about it. So it just better and better. Where am I now? I must be item number 4. Write it down. A Nobel Prize winning economist, Paul Samuelson, once made the observation that he never knew what he was thinking until he wrote it down. First time I heard him say that, or I read that comment, I thought, that's really kind of interesting. Because I'd had many times the experience that I thought I had a great idea, and I would sit down with a pencil and paper and start trying to write down my idea, and it would just immediately become apparent to me what an idiotic thing it was that I had been thinking, or that there was this key issue that I had thought I hadn't thought about at all. But even more on the other side of this story is the idea that if I just, when I'm starting to think about a problem, even if I have no idea of how to approach it, if I just begin with a big sheet of paper, blank, a pencil is critical, and a big eraser, that's why the pencil is critical. And I just start writing down what I think I know, what the ingredients of the problem are, without any idea of how this is all going to, they're all going to be tied together. Maybe some of the things are irrelevant. Maybe I won't list some of the things that are, but just seeing the thing on the list helps me organize my thinking. And then it occurred to me that in the computer metaphor, our brains are really like the CPU of the system. And what they need is random access memory. And the random access memory, of course, is the piece of paper. Now, to make the random access memory really useful, it's got to be something you can load back into the CPU very quickly. And key to doing that is making what you put on the paper crystal clear. So, for example, if you're going to draw a graph of something or a diagram, you make sure that it's just totally clear. The axes are labeled, that there's no question. If you go back in 3 months and look at it, you'll immediately see what you were thinking about. That's just a hugely useful thing to me. It smells like something died in there. But I digress. Let me concentrate on getting up on the divided highway here without getting run over, and then I'll continue. Now, the last thing on my list is really just a recommendation. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I'd be totally remiss in not mentioning a wonderful book by a mathematician named Polya, P-O-L-Y-A, called How to Solve It. Polya was, again, a very smart guy. He spent his whole life thinking about solving problems and how to facilitate that process. And he had a number of wonderful observations. One of the first is that he thought that all problem-solving activity was pretty similar. Didn't matter whether you were talking about economics or physics or law or biology or math, whatever. If you had a problem to solve, there were many structural aspects that were similar no matter what the area. And he would talk about questions that you should ask yourself, like, how is this problem similar to other problems that I've confronted before? And so forth. There's a whole list of questions in Polya about just kind of how to get yourself started on things by just having a set of good questions that you can ask yourself. And so, for example, not a good question is, why am I such an idiot? Or why is this so hard for me to do? This kind of thing is not on his list, and it's not on my list anyway. Polya, How to Solve It. Wonderful book. This, my impression is, I'm married to a lawyer who practiced in New York for a while, and I don't know personally, but I've heard the story that there were many big town law firms in New York, major law firms. They would hand out copies of Polya to every new associate. Anyway, I used to recommend that to all my students, and I recommend it to you. Well, I hope you might have found some of these observations useful. It's very different than what I usually do. If you like this sort of thing, please leave a comment. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.